James' car rolled to a stop at the end of the darkened driveway, where an unfamiliar car sat beneath the weak glow of the porch light. He stared at the sleek, dark vehicle, its glossy surface reflecting the night. Every line of its frame spoke of luxury, a type of extravagance that hadn't set foot on this property before. The sight of it struck him like a sharp chill down his spine. Fatigue from the hours-long drive vanished as suspicion replaced it. This wasn't the homecoming he had envisioned, after days spent in sterile boardrooms and hotel rooms that hummed of distant traffic. He had yearned for the familiar comfort of his home, the warm embrace of Laura, his wife. But now, standing in the shadows of his own property, the night air carried an unfamiliar tension. He reached for the handle, pausing as the faint murmur of music slipped through the cracked window. It was barely perceptible, an upbeat rhythm punctuated by Laura's laughter. But there was another voice mingling with it, deep and confident, one he didn't recognize. A cold resolve settled over him as he shut the car door quietly. He approached the house, noting how the yellow glow seeped through drawn curtains, casting distorted patterns on the manicured lawn. James' heartbeat thudded in his chest, each step a question, each breath loaded with a possible answer that could shatter the life he knew. Hand on the doorknob, he braced himself, ready to step into the unknown. The soft click of the door echoed in James' ears as he stepped inside, met with a warm wave of air, perfumed with the faint scent of champagne and Laura's favorite lavender candles. The living room was alive with muted voices and the clink of glasses. For a heartbeat, James stood frozen, letting his eyes adjust to the dim glow of the chandelier that lit the room in a golden haze. He absorbed the scene like a puzzle, disjointed and surreal. The centerpiece of the living room was Laura, laughing as if the world hadn't shifted under James' feet. She was radiant in a dress that hugged her in ways he hadn't seen in months. Her hair fell in loose curls, cascading over her bare shoulders. The sound of her laughter, once the music of his soul, now grated against him. It was carefree, bordering on flirtatious, and something inside James coiled tight. Next to her stood a man with an air of practiced charm, mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that spoke of success. He held his glass with the confidence of someone who belonged, the corner of his mouth lifting in an easy smile that sent another pang of anger through James' chest. Laura's friends gathered around, some casting uneasy glances at James as the door closed behind him, their conversation faltering. The moment fractured into silence. Laura's smile faltered, eyes wide as they locked onto James. Her shock was a blow, confirmation more potent than any words could have offered. The stranger's smile dimmed, his posture tightening as he read the room with sudden awareness. A friend nervously shifted, setting a drink on the table with a soft thud. James remained rooted, taking in every detail the spilled droplets of champagne on the polished floor, the decorations strung across the room that celebrated something he hadn't been invited to understand. The silence deepened, pressing down on everyone like a lead weight. The tension in Laura's face was almost tangible, a mix of guilt and dread. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if words might betray her more than the silence already had. James' gaze remained steady, sweeping from Laura to the stranger whose charm had evaporated in an instant. The man's fingers flexed nervously around the stem of his glass, and James noted this detail, marking him as the intruder he was. "I didn't know we were hosting tonight," James said, his voice controlled, cold enough to leave the air brittle. The question lingered like smoke, burning and sharp, daring someone to answer. Laura's friends exchanged glances, none willing to be the first to speak. A soft click came from the stereo as the music stopped, an eerie punctuation to the scene. Laura's throat bobbed as she swallowed, the pallor of her skin deepening. "James, you're home early," she finally managed, her voice strained. "Yes," he replied, eyes still fixed on the man who hadn't dared move. "I am." The weight of unspoken accusation swirled in the room, trapping everyone in its pull. James let the moment stretch, watching as guilt settled like a shroud over Laura, and tension clamped down on the guests. The silence screamed the truth louder than any confrontation could. James' heart thudded heavily in his chest, but his expression remained stone. He scanned the room slowly, taking in the fragile arrangement of forced smiles and darting eyes. Each second seemed to stretch into an eternity as the occupants of the room shifted uneasily. The light glittered off the champagne glasses in their hands, once symbols of revelry, now awkwardly clutched, as if for defense. Laura took a small step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I wasn't expecting you back tonight." The quiver in her tone was slight, but enough to betray her. James could see the thin sheen of sweat along her temple, the way her eyes searched his face for a hint of how much he knew. "I can see that," James replied, his voice so calm it was chilling. He looked at the guests, all of whom avoided his gaze except for the man standing nearest Laura. The stranger's confident demeanor had shattered, leaving behind only a man with a forced smile and a jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle pulsed at his temple. "Who is this?" James asked, nodding at the man. The question landed like a challenge, suffocating the room with silence. One of Laura's friends, a woman with short blonde hair and an ill-fitting red dress, shifted from foot to foot, her eyes flicking nervously between Laura and James. "This is..." Laura's voice cracked, and she paused, stealing a glance at the man who dared not meet her eyes. "This is Mark. He's a friend." James nodded slowly, letting the lie hang between them. He turned his gaze directly to Mark, studying him with a gaze so penetrating it made the older man's bravado slip further. Mark tried to summon a nod of acknowledgement, but it came off stiff and awkward. "Well, Mark," James said, the words carrying an undertone as sharp as glass, "you're quite a guest of honor tonight." The observation was harmless on its surface, but the chill in his voice suggested otherwise. Mark opened his mouth, as if to respond, but closed it without a word, his hand dropping the untouched glass to the coffee table with a barely audible clink. The atmosphere turned suffocating, the guests now mere spectators trapped in a scandal they hadn't anticipated. A few shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the doorway, as if calculating how quickly they could leave without drawing more attention. Laura's pale hand reached for James, a gesture of pleading, but he subtly leaned back, letting her hand hover in the space between them. The rejection was subtle, but it struck her visibly. "James, please." "Let's talk," she whispered, a crack of desperation bleeding into her tone. James looked at her, then around the room, taking in each face that was complicit through their silence. He let the seconds drag on until every shallow breath was an admission, every averted eye a confession. Without another word, he turned, heading back toward the door, leaving the silence heavy and unresolved behind him. James stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin as the door clicked shut behind him. The muffled sounds of stunned whispers and shuffling feet followed him, but he didn't turn back. The driveway, with its harsh gleam from the security light above, suddenly felt alien, a distorted version of the place he had once called home. The unfamiliar car gleamed menacingly, a physical manifestation of the betrayal he had just witnessed. The stillness of the neighborhood was almost mocking, as if the world outside continued its tranquil routine, oblivious to the emotional implosion he had just endured. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath that failed to ease the ache in his chest. His hands trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists, pushing the adrenaline and anger into the dark recesses of his mind. Inside, Laura watched his retreat through the window, her face stricken with fear and regret. The room had begun to empty as her friends, sensing the collapse of any pretense of celebration, hurried to make polite but hasty exits. Mark stood frozen, eyes flicking from Laura to the now empty doorway. The tension in his posture suggested he was weighing his options to stay and try to explain or make a silent escape before James returned. Laura's voice, tight with urgency, cut through the awkward silence. "Mark, you should go," she said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plea. He nodded stiffly, placing his untouched glass down with a slight tremble and slipping out without a word, the click of the door behind him echoing in the now emptier room. As Laura's last friend muttered hurried apologies and followed suit, the weight of solitude pressed down on her. The remnants of the party crumpled napkins, half-empty glasses, and scattered confetti now mocked the once celebratory atmosphere. It felt wrong, all of it. The guilt that had taken root over the past weeks now bloomed fully, suffocating her. She walked to the window and looked out at James, who was standing at the far end of the driveway, staring out into the night as if the darkness could offer him answers. The sight of him there, alone and unmoving, twisted something deep within her. The realization of what she had risked hit her like a wave, but it was too late to change the tide she had set in motion. James felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket, but he ignored it. He knew it would be from Laura or one of the guests trying to explain or apologize, their words meaningless now. Instead, he focused on the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing, willing himself not to react, not to let the hurt erupt into anger. He needed clarity, space to think. After a few moments, James turned, his eyes catching the faint movement of Laura's silhouette behind the window. He met her gaze for an instant, a flicker of unspoken accusations, disappointment, and the rawness of pain. Then, without a second glance, he walked down the driveway and away from the house, the sound of his footsteps fading into the still night. James walked down the quiet suburban street, the cool breeze whispering through the trees and carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. His mind swirled with disjointed thoughts, each one sharper than the last. The tension in his muscles felt like coiled steel, refusing to ease. Every step seemed to carry the weight of what he had left behind, the painful tableau of betrayal etched into his memory. The hollow echo of his footsteps merged with the soft rustle of leaves, grounding him in the present, though his mind wanted to drift back into the past. How had it come to this? He thought of the early years with Laura, the small moments that had once been everything, shared laughs over late-night dinners, quiet mornings where they spoke with nothing but glances. Those moments felt like relics now, buried beneath the rubble of suspicion and the harsh reality he had walked into tonight. Laura remained by the window, her hand pressed to the cold glass as she watched James disappear into the shadows. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, and her mind raced with a chorus of what-ifs and desperate strategies to fix what felt irreparably broken. The soft glow from the streetlight outside illuminated her reflection, highlighting eyes red-rimmed with regret. How long had it been since they'd truly seen each other? Not just physically, but deeply, where intentions and fears lay. A chime from her phone pulled her from her reverie. It was a message from one of her friends who had just left, filled with a hurried apology and well-meaning but hollow reassurances. Laura ignored it, letting the phone fall from her hand onto the side table. Her eyes caught the trail of confetti that led from the living room into the hallway, sparkling under the dim light, an absurd reminder of what had just been celebrated in her husband's absence. Outside, James turned a corner and sat down on a low stone wall that lined one of the neighborhood gardens. The cold seeped through his shirt, but he barely noticed. His mind cycled through the expressions he'd seen on Laura's face, the subtle hesitations he'd overlooked in the past weeks, each one now a clue he wished he had paid attention to earlier. He stared at the sky, the stars indifferent and distant, offering no comfort. A part of him wanted to march back, to demand answers from Laura, to confront the man who had dared to invade his home and life. But James' instincts, honed from years of negotiations and boardroom strategies, kept him rooted. Reckless anger had no place here, clarity would serve him better. The revelation of infidelity wasn't just about the act, it was about the unraveling of trust, the realization that he had shared a life built on crumbling ground. The sound of a car starting pulled him from his thoughts. Mark's unfamiliar car rolled down the street, its headlights sweeping over James. For a moment, the two men's eyes met through the windshield. Mark's face, caught in that brief flicker of light, was pale, mouth set in a grim line of fear and guilt. James watched as the car accelerated down the road, the rumble fading into the distance, leaving silence in its wake. James exhaled deeply, a breath that carried more than air, it carried resolve. He knew that the confrontation would come, but it wouldn't be fueled by blind rage. He would seek out the truth and face it on his terms, with control. The battle ahead would be fought with patience, strategy, and the cold, calculating determination that had earned him respect in his career. James stood, pushing himself off the stone wall as the sound of Mark's car receded into the quiet night. The sudden absence of movement around him felt deafening, a stark reminder of how alone he now was. The streetlights cast long, spectral shadows that danced across the pavement, elongating his figure as if echoing the burden he now carried. He walked back in measured steps, each one a deliberate choice not to run, not to barge in and give in to the chaotic swirl of emotion inside him. Back at the house, Laura sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling as she replayed the scene in her mind. The room that had been filled with laughter and light now felt hollow, every festive decoration a mocking symbol of her choices. The silence was crushing, broken only by the gentle tick of the wall clock, counting down the moments before reality forced its way back into the space. She rubbed her arms, trying to ward off the chill that wasn't just in the room but seemed embedded deep within her. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Laura's eyes snapped to the entrance as James stepped in, his face expressionless but eyes dark with thought. She rose instinctively, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to gauge what would happen next. For a moment, neither spoke, the room holding its breath alongside them. "James," Laura began, her voice barely a whisper, but he held up a hand, a signal that cut her off mid-sentence. He walked past her, setting his keys on the console table with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. She flinched at the sound, sensing that words would not save her tonight. James scanned the room, taking in the remnants of the celebration, the confetti that glittered like cold stars under the light, the half-empty glasses with lipstick smudges that weren't hers, the dent in the sofa cushion where Mark had sat. The details, once insignificant, now screamed at him, painting a portrait of what had happened in his absence. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but strained, a single word that carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. Laura opened her mouth to answer, but no coherent words came. The silence stretched again, heavier now. James turned to face her, eyes locking onto hers with a gaze that saw past any facade she could conjure. He wasn't seeking an excuse, he was assessing, understanding the depth of what had been lost. He wanted to hear the truth, not for reconciliation, but for closure. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Laura stammered, eyes wide and glistening with tears. "It was a mistake, James, just a mistake." Her voice cracked on the last word, as if trying to convince herself of its truth. "A mistake," James repeated, tasting the word like ash in his mouth. His composure held, but his jaw clenched as he forced himself not to look away. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was tempered by a deeper wound: betrayal, a kind that rewrote the rules of their shared life. That's what this was? Just one mistake? He gestured around the room, the decorations, the ghost of laughter still hanging in the air. Laura wiped at her eyes, shaking her head as if that simple action could turn back time. "It got out of control," she admitted, her voice small. "I didn't know how to stop it." James exhaled sharply, the sound breaking the fragile silence. He took a step forward, and for the first time she saw a shift in him, not the cold, distant detachment, but a deeper, more resonant pain that came from within. "I trusted you, Laura. I trusted that what we built was real." But now, his voice dropped, and he looked at her as if seeing a stranger for the first time. "Now I can't unsee this. I can't pretend it didn't happen." Laura's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, James, we can fix this. I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air, but they felt insubstantial, as if they dissolved before they could reach him. James nodded slightly, not as a gesture of agreement, but as an acknowledgement that he had heard her. Yet, it was clear the apology couldn't bridge the chasm between them. He turned and walked toward the stairs, pausing only once with his back to her. "I'll stay in the guest room tonight. We'll talk tomorrow," he said, voice flat and final. It was neither an invitation nor a promise, just a declaration that this conversation was done for now. Laura sank back onto the couch as James disappeared up the stairs. The house creaked as if it, too, felt the strain of what had unfolded. In the hallway, James reached the top step and closed his eyes, gripping the railing. The silence followed him like a shadow, but it was no longer a companion, it was a reminder of what had shattered beyond repair.